Welcome to the show, John.
Thanks for having me, Steve. How are you, man?
I'm doing really, really well, and you're joining me all the way from your home in sunny, well, still sunny, I would think,
Sunny,
Manhattan
yeah.
at the moment.
Beautiful day. Beautiful day, yeah.
Fantastic, man. Look, I'm really excited for today's conversation. On this show, this is something like episode 392, and we've spoken with all sorts of people. Goodness. And oftentimes it's about unpacking lessons that can essentially help someone get to whatever their definition of success is. And this is something that you have experience with, climbing that sort of mountain and getting to the top and finding out that perhaps it wasn't all it was cracked up to be, and it came with all sorts of things that you weren't expecting. And we'll get into that today. But I'd love to just take a step back and go back to your childhood, because you became a successful entrepreneur, but as a kid, you weren't a exceptional student, from what I understand.
That is a gross understatement. I was a miserable student. And I don't think it stemmed from a pure inability to do school work. I think it was more at a kind of an early age. I became resentful of education, of the system. I didn't want to be told I have to be in a classroom for 8 hours a day. I didn't want to have to spend my time learning about, the Italian Renaissance when I could go learn about something I cared about, like business. And so this was age like 13, 14 in middle school here, where I just started kind of rebelling, I guess. Mm-hmm. And so that led to, basically failing out of high school and having to wheel and deal a little bit in order to pass. And then, if it were left up to me, I would have just skipped uni and moved on with my life. But my father is an immigrant from Venezuela. And so for him, education is incredibly important. He's a very smart guy. He had multiple master's degrees, and that was a big thing for him. And so it would have been impossible for me not to pursue education. So I fumbled. I got kicked out of 2 universities, barely finished through a third. So yeah, needless to say, I didn't exactly have a strong academic track record early on.
Yeah. And I love that parallel. I reflect on my parents, and they moved here from Yugoslavia, which was a communist country, and they instilled these sort of values of hard work and education. And it's, at the time you're like, man, I don't want to study, but you look back on it now and you think, well, I'm glad they put me on that road. But something else you touched on there was, it wasn't that you weren't capable or intellectually inclined. It's just that you weren't interested in the stuff you were learning. It's like that old adage, if you teach a goldfish to climb a tree, it'll spend its whole life thinking it's stupid.
Right. Yeah. For me, it was a combination of not being interested, but it was also, I just learned in a very specific way. I learned by doing, I learned by experimenting, I learned by trial and error. I actually wonder if I have some undiagnosed learning disability, because and I'm not even being facetious, if I sit in a room and someone is telling me something, or even they tell it to me 100 times, it's very hard for me to understand it, even when I really applied myself and really tried. But if I do it myself, if I see it in practice, I'll give you a great example. I learned to trade options. And I read, I don't know how many books on options, just because I was fascinated by the concept of options. I think I must have read 5 books cover to cover on options. I didn't know a fucking thing about options when I finished the 5th book. I didn't know a thing. And then I just started trading them. And within about a month of trading them, I was able to speak the language, make money. I understood them completely. So that's just how my brain works. And so the traditional educational system just isn't that conducive for how I've always, been geared towards learning.
Yeah. And I think that makes sense. And it reminds me of that Chinese proverb, tell me, I'll forget, show me, I may remember, involve me, and I'll understand. Like actually being immersed in the activity. It's such a much more valuable way to learn.
For me, it was,
I understand that you also taught yourself or potentially learned in school programming at the age of 11.
That's when it started. Yeah. So my father brought home our first PC, and this was, early 90s, going on the mid 90s. And so, for me, we grew up in a pretty, kind of low to mid-income household. There was 4 kids. So there wasn't a lot of extra money to go around. So we didn't travel much as a family. We didn't have anything that was like kind of above and beyond what we would need to be, a healthy family. And so when a computer came home, that was a pretty big deal. Was that
a 486, John?
I think that was a 386.
386, yeah.
Even before that. So this is a bit ago. And so, I think it was given to my father, maybe when they were like recycling computers at work. It was something like that.
Yeah.
And I just tore it apart. I was fascinated by this machine that could do these things. I wanted to know what was inside of it that made it do that. And so I began kind of going outside or inside out to understand the computer. Mm-hmm. And I was completely taken by it for whatever reason. I don't know what it was. I thought it was the coolest thing in the entire world. And so I basically dedicated all of my time to learning about it. And in the process, learned how to build computers, became kind of a hardware guy, started gaming, hacking, programming, all of the things. And yeah, that started in my, about 11, 12 years old. And then by the time I was 14, going on 15, I started my first technology business.
Yeah, fantastic. So coming from a low to middle income household, would you say that was one of the triggers that got you to pursue entrepreneurship, be it as a 15-year-old founding your first tech company or later on founding AKTA? What were the triggers that really got you to pursue that rather than taking the comfortable path of a career in the corporate world?
It's going to sound like a bit of a non-answer because I don't know. I never stopped and said, right, do I want to be an entrepreneur? I didn't even know there was a word called entrepreneur. Right. I wasn't exposed to entrepreneurship. There's no entrepreneurs in my family. Obviously you knew of like famous American entrepreneurs at that time. You would have heard about, Bill Gates or even like Henry Ford, and you'd research these people, but I never understood that was a career path. For me, it was purely natural. I would see a problem and I was like, right, I want to go solve that problem. And I don't exactly know why I'm built like that. I'm not sure where this kind of endless need to fix things and build things and innovate comes from. And obviously once you start doing it, then you realize that you can be in control of your own life. You can make some money that no one's giving you. You're making it, you're creating it out of nothing. And that became pretty enticing. And so I think I became an entrepreneur just by proxy of that's how I'm built. That's how my brain works. And it was a tough run though. It wasn't like my first company, crushed it. We did okay. It then ended in disaster because I lost the business to a friend. That was kind of a big lesson in trust and kind of in business right there. Yeah. And then, as it went, like, the next 10 years was a slog, like just lots of failures, lots of tough lessons, personally, professionally. It was a long journey to even get to the point of being 26 to start AKTA. Yeah. Yeah. And oftentimes those journeys, you might think, man, this is so difficult, but were there character lessons that you took out of that sort of 10-year slog that you then applied into entrepreneurship? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything I learned in those, call it like 14 years leading up to starting AKTA, is why AKTA succeeded. Ultimately, when I first started, again, I didn't recognize it as entrepreneurship. I recognized it as, I know how to do something. A person might need it. Maybe they can pay me money to do it. Right. So it was just a very simple kind of train of thought. And then I was involved in all different kinds of businesses. I was involved in a video game marketing startup. I was involved in a technology advertising company. And so I learned all these different aspects of the business world, and also learned just some very like deep level intrinsic lessons about business that you can't learn without doing it and kind of either succeeding or getting kicked in the teeth. A very good example of this is I used to be very personal about business and very sensitive about business. And I would have subscribed for a long time to the premise that your business is your baby. And this is a piece of you, and you should treat it as if it was your own child. And I learned that that's not true. And I learned that very few people who succeed have that mindset. And it's hard to admit because it makes you sound a little bit cold, but the reality is your business isn't your baby. It's a machine. It's like a piece of steel, and you got to beat that thing senseless over time and mold it into what you want. And sometimes you got to cut pieces of it off. Sometimes you got to throw it away. Like, it is not personal. And you have to remove, I'm a kind of an emotional guy. I'm a sensitive guy. You got to remove all of that to be a highly successful entrepreneur. And so those were examples of lessons that I learned early, and I was able to apply, when I had AKTA. Yeah. And
it seems to me that that's something that a lot of entrepreneurs, particularly first or second time entrepreneurs, might fall into that trap of deriving so much of their identity from their business to the point where if it is taken away from them for whatever reason, their whole life just basically comes crumbling down.
Yeah, or making really poor decisions because it is that familial relationship. Like, for instance, you make a bad hire. You love the person, but they're shitty at their job. If you're not ready to fire that person the next day, you've already lost. Now, it could be hard to do. What if it's your friend, or what if it's your sibling, or, what if it's these kind of things? And if you keep that person on because they're too close to you and you don't want to hurt their feelings, or you've already lost. The game's over. And so it sounds cold, but you don't become successful acquiescing to, your kind of natural emotions. You have to change your mindset. And that's why, that's why a lot of us kind of go crazy doing this, because it doesn't always feel good. It's not always a nice journey, but that's part of the game.
And is part of, say, treating your business like a baby also over investing in terms of the amount of hours you put into the business? Could be 12, 14-hour days, and you neglect every other aspect of your life by virtue of that?
Well, I think that is more par for the course of entrepreneurship. Even when you're doing it kind of quote unquote right, it does become all consuming. Entrepreneurship is a selfish game, too selfish, and that leads a lot of us down very bad paths, but it is selfish. We make all kinds of crazy decisions that are not healthy, be that personal or familial or whatever. And it's a lot of it's not fun stuff to deal with, but working a lot and over investing, I think, is very characteristic of an entrepreneur. I don't know one person that's successful that doesn't do that. That's kind of what you have to do. It's very difficult, maybe impossible, as an early stage entrepreneur to have like this incredibly perfect balanced life and be crushing it on a startup. But that doesn't mean that there are better ways to do it than like how I did it, for instance, or how I see other people doing it, where we go so all in that we give, we make bets we shouldn't make. We give pieces of ourselves we shouldn't give. We go too far. And that's where it gets scary. And that's what happened to me during AKTA is, this company was one of the fastest growing in America. By every measurable metric, it was a success. And I was basically melting down and basically dying as a human being in the background the whole time. And it was very challenging.
Yeah. So with AKTA, I mean, you founded that when you were 26, and for our audience's benefit, AKTA was essentially a tech consulting and design firm. And you grew that from 0 to about 45 odd employees in 5 years, and then sold it to Salesforce for an undisclosed sum.
We were way bigger than that. Okay.
How
I don't quite disclose exactly, but considerably bigger than that. Yeah, we made some acquisitions. It was a big company at the end. It's I don't. First of all, I'm kind of legally bound, but also I just don't like to get into like the size, to use that as kind of the success metric, because growth at all costs, growing 1,200% year over year isn't necessarily a good thing. In fact, that was part of what led to how challenging the journey was. So.
Yeah. And sometimes with early stage entrepreneurs, they might take on, say, venture capital or external funding, and then you're bound to these pretty aggressive growth targets, which force you to basically burn the midnight oil and just invest every spare minute of energy into your business. And say you can do that for maybe a year or two, but you might find yourself burning out after a couple of years and making all sorts of bad decisions. So, I mean, I guess in your case, when you were driving or were essentially targeting that 1,200% growth, I mean, what were some of the drawbacks that came with that?
Just about everything. I mean, it's very difficult to do. And I think, you mentioned like venture capital funding, and I bootstrapped my company. I never raised a penny from anybody the entire time. And in some ways that sounds great, right? Because there's no one, looking over your shoulder. There's no one who can tell you what to do. You don't have a board controlling you. And you're only putting the pressure on yourself. Whereas you hear these horror stories about venture capital investing, right? They get screwed over by investors, that they overtake control, they have varying opinions, all sorts of things. But bootstrapping isn't necessarily a easy street either, right? I mean, we have to rely only on ourselves. We have no backup plan. We have no parachute. We have no mentorship. We have no guidance. We're just doing it all ourselves. And for me, I was broke when I started the company. So you're doing it with nothing, and your margin of error is like, it is incredible how easy it would be for the whole thing to just explode at any given time. And so it really does feel like you're kind of walking uphill carrying like a big grenade. And it's like, if you slip at any given time before you get to the top of that mountain, you're done. And that isn't great either. So I'm not sure which path would have been easier. You know, had I raised 10 million bucks and used that for scale and had some, you know, cushion in the bank, whatever, I don't know if that would have been better or worse. But I chose not to do it, but it made it very tough because you have nothing going except what you can self-generate any given time. And that makes it, that increases the pressure a lot.
Yeah. Well, we can hypothesize about what the counterfactual would have been if you did raise capital, but we'll never know. I think it's also encouraging because I think so many entrepreneurs think that that's kind of the default thing they have to do. You need to raise capital to build a business. But oftentimes when you do raise capital, you become someone's bet. A venture capital firm might place 10 bets, hoping that one of them returns the losses and covers and creates that profit and generates that profit rather. And you ultimately might give away a large percentage of your business at a low valuation, and all sorts of pitfalls that entrepreneurs can fall into, rather than building a business, solving a problem, generating some income, developing a several $1 million valuation to start with potentially. And then if you need to raise capital to shoot a rocket up the butt of your business, then do so, but you're going to do so at a much higher valuation.
Yeah. And that, you know, if given the choice, that would probably be the desired path of any entrepreneur. But I can tell you what happened to me is when I went to get started, I would have loved to raise money off the beginning because I literally had no money. I think my net investment at AKTA was like $800. Yeah. I mean, because I didn't have more than 800 to put in. So I bought some business cards and a laptop and registered an LLC. That was literally my entire investment. So had I had 50 grand in the bank, it would have been nicer because I could have, you know, put some money into anything that I didn't have at that point. But, and no one would give me a damn dollar at that point, not a penny. So I had no choice but to do it alone. And then what happened is you start to get bigger. You start throwing off millions of dollars. You're being written up in newspapers and magazines. You're doing TED Talks. And now anyone in the world will give you money. And at that point, my attitude was like, go fuck yourself. Like, you wouldn't give it to me then. I'm sorry, can I swear on your show, by the way? I probably should have asked. Okay, good. Okay, good. But I'm like, you wouldn't give it to me when I needed it. And now that I have beat the odds, you want to buy you want to take what I've built. And I was just like, absolutely not. And that's why I began refusing to even have the conversations later on. That's probably a bit of an ego thing right there. Again, had I taken money towards the end, it would have softened a lot of the load, I think. But at that point I was like, no, I want to own this entire damn thing. You're not going to take it away now that I've de-risked the whole thing. Yeah.
So just to go back to, say, the early days of that arc with AKTA, I mean, you had $800 in your bank account. That's what you put into the business. How did you go from, say, investing $800 to generating your first, I don't know, $100,000? Like, what did that process look like?
Yeah. Well, technically, to my name, I had about negative $180,000. Okay.
Yeah.
At the time I started it, you know, and that's a combination of student loans, which I know is a very American concept. Student loans and travel and failed startups and just, you know, not very good financial planning at that point. And so, you know, it was even less than 800. That's just what I had, like, on one last credit card to put in, kind of thing. And I basically just was a relentless networker. I went to everyone. I was living in Chicago, and I went to everyone who would listen and just said, hey, I'm building the best design company in Chicago. I kept saying that to everybody. And I understood a little bit. Everyone else understood nothing. So I was like, I had this tiny advantage to speak the language a little bit, to understand the value. And it was pretty remarkable. The first true client was a company called Vosges. They were a chocolate company, of all things. They make this high-end chocolate in Chicago. And they needed some, like, kind of e-commerce design consulting work. It was nothing. I think my entire retainer was $3,000 a month or something, but that was huge. And that cash flowed me to keep going. And then the next deal I got was actually a British company called Topgolf. So the first true contract that was AKTA signed was $300,000. And, you know, I look back on that and I write about this entire experience in the book, but it was pretty insane that a business would have paid me 300 grand when I had no portfolio, no team, no experience, nothing. And they knew that. Like, I was pretty transparent with, like, this is a new company, but I was just very confident and very desperate. And I think that they knew I would not let this fail. And so they stroked us a check for 300 grand and we built their stuff. So
yeah, I think it's an interesting point you make, because sometimes just not having a massive portfolio of clients gives you an advantage insofar as your client thinking, well, this guy hasn't got anyone else, so he's going to go all in on us. He's going to take care of us, versus just being a number at some other company.
Yeah. It's, I mean, in some ways you can see why that might've been an attractive thing for them, right? To say, hey, okay, this guy's desperate. He's hungry. He's going to crush it. On the other hand, it's like, could you imagine if a lawyer started the law firm? Would you want to be the first client? You know what I mean? You're like, no, I want you to go get a couple hundred clients first, then we'll talk. So it's a tough thing. And that's the case for any service business. Where do you start? And usually where you see them starting is that it's the equivalent of like somebody who works in PR, who works at an agency. You know, they work at a global agency for 20 years. All of this work builds up, they get all these relationships and networking. Then they leave and kind of take a big chunk of that with them. And that becomes how they start. So for me, being a non-designer who had never worked at a consultancy, starting a consultancy was a bit atypical, to say the least. But I just wasn't going to let it fail. I couldn't allow it to not succeed. So
yeah, no, it's funny what you say there about the law firm. It's kind of like what Elon Musk says about going to Mars. You know, I'll wait for other people to go first, and once it's validated, then I'll book myself a ticket.
Yeah. So that was definitely the tough part of starting the service company.
Yeah. Well, I can imagine. So the long story short is that in a period of 5 years, you built the company up to whatever size it was, and you've effectively sold it to Salesforce, one of the biggest tech companies in America, Mark Benioff, Salesforce. And you were only about 31 years old when you sold the company. Yeah,
I was turning 32. Yeah, turning 32. So I was 31 at the time. Yep.
Right. Turning 32. Were you single at the time, or?
Yeah, thankfully.
Yep, so single at the time, you'd spent 5 years building this company, and you found yourself with no doubt a decent amount of spare capital. You no longer had that $180,000 debt. I imagine the world would have opened up to you at that point. And I'm keen to unpack, like, what did that look like? Like, I imagine parties, drugs, sex, all sorts of stuff that, 20-somethings and people in their early 30s who are single males might aspire to. Yeah. But maybe that comes with some sharp edges.
Yeah, well, all of those things I got involved in during the company.
Right.
And this, I think the logic would dictate that in this kind of journey, you'd be so busy and so consumed running the business that you're kind of focused on that. You make a bunch of money and then you go kind of wild. I did a bit of the opposite. I actually... this business was so stressful and it was so intense, and I had no guidance for how to manage any of this. I had no mentors. I had no colleagues doing this at the beginning. So I really felt like I was the first and only person to ever do this. And it created a lot of uncertainty. And so I would vacillate between thinking, I know exactly what I'm doing. I am qualified for this. I am as smart as people think. I deserve this. And on the very next day, be thinking, this is all bullshit. I am a fraud. I am a fake. I have manufactured this out of thin air, and it's going to be destroyed at any given time, and I'm going to lose everything. And I'd go back and forth and back and forth, back and forth. And that is a toxic mindset to be in, especially, when you're also trying to prop up, this company that's now making millions and millions of dollars and everything else. And so, obviously you then have to deal with that stress, and you can deal with it very well, or you can deal with it how I did. And how I did was all the things you shouldn't do. It was drugs and partying and sex and drinking and and just every way I could think of to numb myself and to not think about what I was doing during the day. Because if I stopped long enough to think about it, I would basically have a panic attack, because it was such a massive weight sitting on me all the time. And I would have nightmares, literal nightmares, that phone rings and that one client who's, half of your revenue, because that's what happens sometimes in service, says, "Hey, John, listen, the board's made a decision and we're going to go with somebody else for this. So sorry." And it's like, boom, done. You're done. And everything you built, everything you put together, it's gone. And not just disappears, you'd have to give everything back. Like I would have gone from a millionaire to bankrupt in 20 minutes. And that is a twisted feeling. And so in order to not deal with that feeling, I went to all the stuff you shouldn't do. And as entrepreneurs, we actually have propensity for this. We are more likely to have mental health issues. We're more likely to have substance abuse issues. We're more likely to burn out. We're more likely to get divorced. And so this is a common story. And that's kind of why I literally wanted to tell it in the book. So,
And so, given all the stresses you were dealing with, given the imposter syndrome, given the, this toxic mindset where you felt that your business could be taken away from you overnight and you'd be bankrupt again. You sought out all these, I suppose, distractions, but those distractions, the sex, the drugs, the parties, ultimately didn't help. From what I understand, you kind of it just set off a spiraling effect emotionally and mentally.
Yeah. And I think, anybody who's dealt with any kind of self-destructive patterns, you convince yourself it might be helping, even though somewhere deep inside is not. And then things are going to come to a pass at some point. It's going to catch up with you. And everyone's situation is unique. And for me, it was, just everything was building, the stress, pressure, risk, and success of the business. And then the partying, the toxic mindset, the self-destruction, they were all building together, and they kind of collided at one point. And it led to the worst week of my life, which I was partying in the middle of a party and blacked out, lost consciousness, and awoke 3 days later in a hospital. And during those 3 days, I didn't remember this, but I was apparently at certain times would wake up and had no clue who I was, where I was. I didn't know my name, didn't know the city I was in, didn't know my phone number, didn't know how to get a hold of my friends or my mom, didn't know how to unlock my phone because I didn't know my passcode. I didn't know who I was. And it turns out I had suffered dissociative amnesia that was a byproduct of a psychotic break. And there were signs that this was coming. Like I can recall in retrospect that, like, in the weeks leading up to that, there were times that I struggled to tell what was real and what wasn't. I remember a time, this is weird to admit, I remember a time where I was watching television and then realized it was off. Like I thought it was on. I thought I was like watching something, and only to then realize it was never on. Like you could tell things were starting to go.
Do you remember what you were watching?
I don't know. I don't. I'm sure it was really fascinating though. And so, like, I kind of realized that there were signs that I was ignoring, of course, and then, had this episode, and it was awful. It was, oh God, it was the worst week ever. And no one came to see me because no one knew I was there, because I couldn't tell anyone I was there. I didn't know I was there. And so you kind of are alone. And the one person that ended up kind of finding me there, because I had tried to call him before I blacked out, was my number 2 at the company, a guy called Kevin. And so he came, even though he couldn't see me because I didn't know who he was, and back and forth. And so it was scary. And it was a wake up call that, what I was doing wasn't working. And if I didn't change something significantly, I wasn't going to survive. That much was clear. My mind and body were throwing up a red flag and saying, you've gone too far. You need to stop. And so that's what led to starting the process of selling the company. Within about, it wasn't long, maybe a couple long in that 2 months or something of that happening. I had instructed my executive team to find a suitable investment firm, financial investment firm, to broker our process. And we did all the diligence inside the company, put ourselves on the open market. We ran a managed auction. And so we pitched AKTA to 90 potential acquirers. I took something like 120 flights in 150 days. Just, I mean, it was a crazy period of time. Just you even start forgetting what city you're in. It doesn't matter. You're just doing the same thing every day, just pitching and pitching and pitching and pitching. And almost exactly 9 months later, we achieved a great deal with Salesforce. And, Salesforce is one of the best companies in America and one of the best acquirers. And my entire team, found very, fortuitous jobs inside Salesforce, and they took great care of us. And I worked for them for the next 7 or 8 months as an executive, came to Australia, did my last project for Salesforce down there, and then took my leave. It was a weird time because you've made your money, and you realize that you could retire if you wanted to, which is a weird feeling at 31 years old. And then you start to ask yourself, well, what do you do now? And what matters? And what is my life? And there's a lot of resetting, a lot of work to be done. A lot of my problems actually got worse after selling the company. A lot of my mental illness, my depression, it got worse because I was so attuned to deal with this incredible level of stress and pressure that when it went away, my brain had like extra bandwidth and just didn't really have much to work on. And so it kind of turned internal, and it was pretty awful. So
business was like a coping mechanism for you.
Yeah. I was saying this to somebody else earlier on an interview that there's a great new documentary on HBO called The Weight of Gold. Mm-hmm. And they're talking to Olympians, and they're going into the mental health of Olympians, because you're talking about somebody who's been trained on one thing since they were like 4 years old, and they know nothing else their entire life. And then usually after they win gold or when they retire, all of that energy has nowhere to go, and it usually turns negatively inward. And the suicide rates, the substance abuse rates amongst Olympians is ridiculously high. It's a tragic, portrayal of people you'd think of as superheroes. And I experienced a bit of that. I really struggled after. I sought support from an amazing doctor in Chicago, and did a lot of work on myself. I did every kind of treatment and therapy that you've ever heard of, and some you haven't. I mean, a lot of stuff. And it was about 6 months later that I wanted just to a bit of an escape, and just to restart my life, and also take some time for myself, which I'd really never done. And so I moved over to Europe, and I built a property in Greece, and I had a place in London, and I split time between the two. And I did that for 4 years. And it was the best and healthiest years of my life, just kind of resetting and enjoying myself and getting back to being a 30-something human. And it was in that period of reflection that I decided to put this story down on paper. And so I wrote the book between London, Mykonos, and Bali during 2018. And my goal was to tell the most honest and raw entrepreneurial story anyone's ever heard.
Yeah. And the book, for our audience's benefit, is called A Practical Way to Get Rich and Die Trying. I love the play on a 50 Cent album. So that's coming out next week. But I mean, you kind of unpacked the story of building the business, selling it, and then kind of going through this process of healing and recovery afterwards. Now, I imagine during that process, I mean, there would have been some kind of reflection upon your ethos, your values, how you were living your life. I mean, what did you learn going through that process of reflection about how you were living, the principles, the values that you perhaps thought brought you to that place? And what did you start thinking differently? Like, what values did you move towards?
Yeah, there was a pretty significant change. What's interesting is that during those years of AKTA, when I was this, high-powered young CEO or whatever you want to call it, I got away from who I am as a human being. I had to kind of be somebody else in order to do this, because a lot of the characteristics, even the ones that we talked about earlier, for having to not think of your business as a baby, whatever, that does not come naturally to me. I'm a pretty sensitive guy. I'm a pretty quiet guy. I'm a pretty private guy. I don't like to make a big splash. I prefer being incredibly kind to people. I don't like being ferocious. And so I had to be a pretty different person And I also like to be quite present. I like to take care of friends and family and to be very good at, being a son, brother, friend, et cetera. And I got away from all those things running the company. And so a lot of it was just kind of getting back to who I actually am. And a lot of that was just time. A lot of that was therapy. A lot of that was, reconnecting with people who I had pushed out of my life during those years. And there was a lot of work to do. But it was amazing. And so, I got back to just enjoying life, which I really hadn't done in many, many years, maybe ever, I guess, of just really just owning, your life and what you care about and focusing on those things. And obviously, financial freedom helps with that because I had never experienced anything like that. As I told you, I grew up in this low to mid income immigrant family where money was never available. And so that changed a lot because when the mental discussion becomes, well, you don't have to work. So what do you do? If the necessity is gone, where does your purpose come from? What do you spend your hours in the day doing? So I had to kind of go back to all of those fundamental questions. And ultimately it was great. It was a lot of work, but it was awesome. I'm a lot more, secure and, truly confident person, not just pretending I'm confident today.
Right.
I have people in my life that I know are there for the right reasons. My relationships, are generally very solid and meaningful. I'm highly invested in my family. I spend a lot of time with my family, especially my little 4-year-old niece. I've been lucky to be around her since, because she was born right after all this. And so really involved in her life. And so those things are incredibly important to me. And so even these days, being back in the US, doing the book, doing the podcast, doing some speaking, kind of coaching, reconnecting with just people and with the world has been great. And now I'm really thinking about the next chapter and what does the next decade look like? And I'm hoping it looks like, a family, and it looks like, kind of more of a, let's say, typical path. So, yeah.
The nuclear family. So I guess something that the Stoic philosophers used to talk about and espouse these values of defining what is enough and contentment, rather than constantly comparing ourselves to the next person and hustling and going for bigger and better. And as an entrepreneur, it can be tempting to, why settle for a $10 million business when I can be a $100 million business? And with that comes a hell of a lot more work and a lot more stress and everything else. So, I mean, in your case, reflecting on your time as an entrepreneur, building AKTA, what would you have done differently? I mean, is there a point where you would have said, actually, I'm good at this point? I mean, was that question of more and bigger and better, did you even sit back and reflect on, why am I chasing this huge target? Aren't I content with, say, a $10 million business, for example?
Yeah. I have spent time thinking about that. And I think there's a few aspects of it. I think when we talk about entrepreneurs, that's a wide ranging term, right? Like the guy who owns, a taxi in New York or is selling in newspapers, they're entrepreneurs for all intents and purposes. The way that in our culture, we tend to use the term is to talk about these high growth, go for gold, usually tech entrepreneurs. And I think what brings us to that mindset is similar to the gold rush in America, like the 1850s, right? Where it was like you had this shot to go and win the lottery, and you had this shot to walk down this path where you might come back rich or dead, right? And you're kind of like, that's kind of worth it. That's kind of tech entrepreneurship today is kind of trade everything and see if you can win the lottery. And there's something attractive about that, obviously, which is why a lot of us do it and try it. I think for me, it was, I think the fundamentals became changing my life position, because if I had gone and worked at some tech company, I probably would have been mildly successful at my job. I could have done sales or something, and I would have probably worked until I retired, until I'm 70 years old, and I would have done fine and made good money. But you do dream about changing everything and changing, getting into generational wealth and changing your entire future and your kids' future and their kids' future. And that became enticing. And just a challenge, I guess, because, I didn't even know what being wealthy was growing up. I had no comprehension for it. And so it's like, but you watch, the rap videos and you watch movies and you're like, that looks cool. And so honestly, for me, it was like, I want to see if I can do it. And so I had put a stretch goal in place when I was a teenager that I wanted to be a millionaire by 30. Mm-hmm. And even when I made that goal, it was like, that's ridiculous, and I didn't know anybody who was on that path or who had that goal. And I achieved that goal. And then when it starts to happen and you start to make a bit of money and you start to wonder what is enough, it's very enticing to go to the next level, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, why have a nice car when you can have 5 really nice cars? And why, why live in a normal apartment when you can live in the penthouse? And so this excessive, need does start to click in, and it's very toxic. At one point I just started buying shit just to buy it. There was no purpose. I had $500,000 in watches, and I had every sports car you can think of. And I lived in a place that I was barely at and was so egregious. It was, just completely obnoxious. And I couldn't tell you now or then why I was doing it. I just could. And so this kind of draw towards excess, I think a lot of us entrepreneurs have. And it's not good, because once you acquire more things, you just have more to worry about, and you're just adding stress to an already stressful situation. And it's not just with material things. Like, I was never a drug addict, like when I finished AKTA, I haven't done drugs since. So it wasn't that I was addicted to the drug. I was addicted to the excess surrounding the drugs. Like, mm-hmm. It became part of the story, part of the game. Same with women, partying, drugs. It was all just to do more and to have more and to see more and to have that crazy lifestyle. It was never the thing itself. And the draw to that is something that's probably intrinsically built very deep inside me. I'm not really sure why. And it's not necessarily a good thing. And that was a tough run. And so in these last years, it's the opposite. I've kind of like distilled down my life. I care about where I live, and I care about taking care of my family, but like all the excess is gone. And that's been a nice thing.
Yeah. So it sounds like you've just minimalized and just simplified your life, and that's just given you a lot more sort of clarity rather than just...
relatively speaking, I think other people might look at my life and still think I'm a crazy person, but like to me, this is normal, and this is very toned down. So yeah.
And I think that relative piece is important. There might be people out there on $100,000 salary, and they could probably relate to the idea of having had an $80,000 salary and now on $100,000, they're spending more, and they've got a slightly nicer apartment and a slightly nicer car. And then if they get to $150,000, then they'll upgrade again. And it kind of never stops until you stop and actually reflect on, hey, what's really enough for me as a person?
It's a trap that a lot of successful entrepreneurs fall into, because, it's crazy to me that you see these guys and girls that go through just the hardest thing you can do in life, which is to create a company and become incredibly successful or wealthy. Yeah. And then within weeks, they're starting a new company, and you're just like, take a fucking break, like stop for a second. But it's a draw. It's that draw to like, well, what if I could do it 10 times as big? What if I could do it 10 times faster? What if, and it's a bad mindset. And that's what's led to a lot of really tragic stories. Like the one that I talk about a lot is, remember Vine, who sold to Twitter? So Colin Kroll, who's the CEO of Vine, sells a Twitter for 180 million in cash or something. That is already insane, multi-generational. You never need to ever consider working again kind of money. And he immediately starts Trivia HQ. Very quickly starts Trivia HQ, raises a bunch of money for that. And automatically he's now doing it again, but even bigger. Like Trivia HQ has this huge valuation. He's cover of, I think it was Forbes or something. Just like crushing it. And then after a holiday party, he, by all accounts, purposely overdosed and took his own life. And it was in that retrospective analysis of his life that his, people close to him kind of said, yeah, this actually isn't that surprising. Like he had demons, he had struggles, yada, yada, but it was never acknowledged in real time. Like he's kept going and going and going and going, but clearly he was doing that trying to escape something. And it's just tragic. And there's a lot of these stories out there. There's a lot of them, And we only hear them in retrospect. We only get to hear about the real journeys when there's a nightmare, like with these deaths, with be it Aaron Schwartz, be it Kate Spade, be it these different people, or when there's a public implosion of a company like a Theranos or a Fire Festival or whatever. Like, that's the only time we hear the real story. All other times we're only shown this bullshit veneer of what we want people to think the journey is. And to me, that's a problem. So, I can only tell my story in retrospect because it happened, between 5 and 10 years ago. So I can write the book and I can now tell people about it. So my story is a retrospect as well. But I'm hoping that if I tell mine and we kind of keep promoting this honesty and vulnerability, then we can kind of bring that closer together, where we can get people to start acknowledging their humanities, acknowledging their struggles, seeking support, and to have that more happening in real time. So we're not just dealing with all this shit in retrospect.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like a lot of the narrative around, say, mental health in society hasn't quite permeated into the entrepreneurial landscape. Like,
not at all.
We have the whole "Are you okay" day kind of thing where we're supposed to check in with each other and you're supposed to feel more comfortable saying, hey, I'm not okay. Whereas 10, 20 years ago, that sort of stuff was stigmatized. But in entrepreneurship, if someone says, hey, how's business? You kind of have to signal that things are good, even though they might not be. Signal to your customers, to your partners, to your investors, to your family, your spouse. You just want people to believe in that journey you're on, rather than signal some kind of vulnerability. And perhaps that's something we need to get better at doing.
100%. And that's one of the double-edged swords, is because we are basically told you have to be perfect as an entrepreneur. You can't show weakness. You can't show vulnerability. Like, people aren't going to believe in you. They're not going to invest in you. They're not going to want to work for you if you aren't superhuman. And so that's what drives us to put on this facade, is that we believe we have to, because that's basically the culture that we exist in today. But of course, we're not superhuman. If anything, we're more flawed and, have more, disposition for issues than others. And so we then just end up masking it and hiding it and lying to everybody, ourselves, and everybody who will listen. And then you can see why that cycle just builds and builds and builds and builds until there's nightmares. And so what's interesting is that in my journey, in experiencing it and now writing about it and talking about it, I've got to really have a better lens on some of the bigger landscape. And it's been amazing to meet some people who are trying to solve this problem. There's a brilliant doctor I've recently, become close with, and we're talking more and more, called Dr. Michael Freeman. And Steve, you've probably heard of his work. So he wrote the paper 5 years ago called "Are Entrepreneurs Touched with Fire?" And he really dug in from a research perspective on our propensity for mental illness and self-destruction and stuff. And he started to put numbers to it. So all of these stats we have about how bad entrepreneurs have it come from him. And he's now created a foundation. I'm going to hope somebody here, Nicole, if you could send us the information so I could say it properly. But he started this foundation, a company. Sorry, not a foundation. He started a company to help to give structure and support and guidance to people who are dealing with these issues. And he's now, it's called ECONA, ECONA, and he's trying to solve the problem. And he's literally dedicating his resources, his profession, to solving this problem, to creating support structures so entrepreneurs can get out of this vicious cycle that we exist in.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's really useful that people are coming together. I think another example is Basecamp and Jason Fried and David Hansen. They published a really good book called "It Doesn't Have to Be Crazy at Work." And their whole ethos is 40-hour work weeks, balance. And they've allegedly done that from day one and built a company that some estimate at being generating about $50 million a year. So I think the more people that can come together and share those insights, the better it will be. We're almost.
I was just going to say on Jason Fried, because we're both Chicago guys, and he built Basecamp in Chicago, and so we watched a lot of that. But I think that's also why they haven't raised money. Because if you went to a venture capitalist and said, hey, we're going to do this better. We're going to work a bit less. We're not going to kill ourselves doing it. A VC is going to be like, well, I'm not giving you money then. And so that is a dynamic that has to change. We have to make it okay to have other dynamics than, grow until you kill yourself, And so Jason's right. And I know Jason, respect Jason. He's right. But the rest of the ecosystem isn't built for that mindset yet. Yeah,
I totally agree. And that's something that's effectively broken systemically with respect to the targets that VCs are going after. And also this cultural misconception that, if you're going to hit that target, you need to work 100 hours a week, when by doing so, you effectively burn yourself out and you don't show up as the best version of yourself anyway. So
and that is a new mindset of recognizing that. But again, we can't fulfill that until we complete the entire circle, the entire arc. Like if just the entrepreneurs are subscribing to that, we can't do it, because then we're not going to get funding. People aren't going to believe in us. So everyone needs to kind of step up and start to become part of the solution. And the entire culture needs to change.
Yeah. And I know you've founded a early stage venture fund as well yourself. Now, is that something that you're espousing, say with your entrepreneurs who come to the table? Like, are you providing that mentorship around, say, how they're building their businesses? And are you, like you say, comfortable with them not killing themselves effectively? I imagine you would be, given everything we've discussed today.
Yeah. I mean, listen, and this is one of those interesting double-edged swords, because again, I have to play into this culture, right? And so if there's 10 angel investors at the table and 10 companies, and there's 9 companies that say, we're going to work as hard as we possibly can, and we're going to become big as possible, and our goal is $1 billion. And then one company says, we're going to go nice and slow. we're going to aim for 100 million in 10 years. And as angel investors, which one are you really going to look at most seriously? Like, let's be honest. Now that's not to say I seek the entrepreneurs that are going to kill themselves. I know that's a negative too, but there's a middle ground where I do coach my entrepreneurs on balance, on seeking support, on being very honest with me. Like, I'm the one who gets the call from the entrepreneur when they're like, listen, I just, woke up from a 3-day bender and I'm, and I don't know what I'm doing. I'm spinning out of control. Like, they call me and because they know they can have that conversation without me, crucifying them or pulling my investment back or whatever. So, that is something I inject, but again, I can't change the entire culture. I can tell my story and do my part, but we need to kind of raise the voices of this across the board.
Definitely. Well, John, you've definitely raised the voice for this on the Future Squared podcast. It's been a fascinating conversation. If people want to pick up a copy of the book, they can do so on Amazon and where all good books are sold. It's called Practical Way to Get Rich and Die Trying. They can find you online at roa.com, on Instagram and Twitter at John Roa. That's ROA. Are there anything else you wanted to share, or any other parting words of wisdom before we wrap up, John?
I don't think, I have much wisdom left, but ultimately, I appreciate people listening. I hope they enjoy the book, and I want to hear about, their experience reading it, and I want to connect. So if people have questions, if they want to continue this conversation, I'm easy to find. Like you said, John Roa on social media. Like, this is a conversation. I don't want to be preaching. I want to have a conversation. So if people want to connect, they know where to find me.
Fantastic. Well, you enjoy the rest of your day, John.
All right, cheers.